Cool. All right, good morning. We have two things to talk about today. The last things I'll talk about with you. One is doing asynchronous updates in Redux. We're going to use a tool called Thunk, um, and it's going to allow us to basically just do fetches and update the state based off of that. The other thing that we're going to talk about is higher order components. So we've kind of been hinting at it. We've seen one kind of version of higher order components, which is that basically you just have nested components where you're saying like this.children. So for example, if you pull in a form from Semantic UI React, that is a higher order component. It takes the inputs or whatever you put inside of it and renders those. But we're going to create functions that take in components that allow us to share functionality across components. I'm not memorizing this. I can just send this out to you. You don't have to memorize it. The practice that we're actually going to do is just building a simple one of these and then incorporating this into our app. And I built something yesterday specifically for you all. No one else has seen this. It's not pretty yet. And it's not finished because I couldn't stay awake any longer. So here it is. We have a dating site that we're going to be working on today. Ali came up with the name. It's brilliant. And I built the app around the name. It's called Significant Otter. Yeah. Yeah. It was Ali's idea. I just took it and ran with it. So I created some mock-ups here. Basically, we've got a bunch of pages that we're going to be going through, right? We've got a profile of someone that you matched. You can only message someone that you matched. It's kind of, I guess, Tinder-ish. I don't know what. It's been a long time since I've been on dating apps, but we'll just pretend like all this makes sense. If you liked a profile, you can't do anything. You have to wait until they match you, right? You can see your profile, which, for time's sake, they all look the same. You can see recommended otters to date. You can log in. You can sign up. Sorry, this website is really shitty for scrolling. So I'm trying to just got to drag this thing across. You can see matches, you can see messages, and you can see liked otters, and obviously these are the same for time's sake. Then, one day I'll create this nice menu that you click on the hamburger thing, but right now it's just a bunch of links, okay? So it's not like this yet. I just didn't have time. But it is semi-functional. So here's what we've got. We've got a site which shows us messages from our matches. This is the message thread. I know it's beautiful. We are Chad Turbox. That is our otter name. And we are chatting with Sarah, doctor, in the house. And I obviously didn't write these. I just used Faker to generate these names and these messages. Anybody know where they're from? Maybe one of them gives it away. Okay, they all give it away. It's from Harry Potter. I don't know Harry Potter that well, but I know these, if it says Harry and I know this thing, that's it. Cool, so you can click on a name, it's going to show the messages. Hopefully there would be a better view of this, but this is what we've got for now. You can see your matches. Also, I don't have any pictures, so this is what it is for now. And then you can see your profile as well, and we're Chad Turbox. This is their bio. Cool. So we basically all I did on the back end. I just want to go over it really quick, just so we are all on the same page. For the back end, I've got pretty much what you all had already built for your Mod 4 backends, which is that I've got a sign up login profile, right? These are all part of the auth flow in the auth kind of README that you had. And then I created some domain models in order to do messages, matches, and liked things, and liked otters. Basically just created a bunch of custom methods on my otters controller. I've got cores enabled. Nothing back here is too crazy. The thing that we're going to focus on today a little bit is auth, and in particular sharing the auth logic that we had to write in many different components across components And then we're going to work on when we send a request to get the user, what does that flow look like, especially in Redux, okay? Yeah, that's pretty much it. So we'll go over my app really quickly just to see what we've got so that we can work with it. I did not end up building login, so I'm just going to comment that out. But we got to sign up that we can work with. But we got to sign up that we can work with. So we got these 4 routes which map to these 4 pages. I've just organized this a little bit differently. It doesn't matter. It's just they're just components that I built, okay, that I'm pulling in, and I'm referencing them like this. So sign up, messages, matches, and profile. And messages, matches, and profile all need a user to be logged in. Okay, this is important. You can't see messages if you're not logged in. You can't see matches. You can't see your profile if you're not logged in. These other ones would be protected, but again, they're not built. Sign up and login don't require that logic, so we don't want to add it to that. And already we can just, already we know, since all 3 of these need the same logic, we don't want to repeat that logic in our components. We actually want to probably draw it out and put it into a shared space that they all can use, right? So I'm keeping it dry, okay? Unlike this morning. I was freaking soaked. So that's what we're going to kind of look at today. I'm going to just close the back end. We're going to look at the front end. But even before we kind of get into fully building it out, I want to first just talk about higher. And this has Redux already in it, so I've got already some Redux stuff there. I want to talk about higher order components first. And to do that, I think that I'm just going to copy over my app, comment all this out, and just work with, just kind of create something custom here. So let's say I have an app, and we have that header again, and it just returns a div with hello world, right? And then this just renders the header. Let's hope that that works. Beautiful. All right. Let's say we have another component here, which is our counter. This is very similar from yesterday. And I want to display something from both of these components, something that essentially they'll both do. So let's say that they both have a nav bar in them, right? This is a very, very silly example. But this will be our counter. This will be our header. I'll save. I didn't close. No, what did I? No, I need a fragment. This is an alternate syntax for fragments. If you haven't seen it, you can do react.fragment, or you can just do, basically, since they are nothing, this kind of makes sense. So I've got my 2 components here, my header up here, and my counter down here. And what I want to do, instead of probably having to repeat that logic in both places, or the logic right now, instead of repeating this, kind of putting this nav on the page, what I could do, approach number 1, is just to create a kind of layout component. And you'll see this if you come back later and look at this app that I've built, the rest of the app, you'll see that I have a couple layouts. I'm mostly using it to abstract styling. Right now there is duplication in them, so it's not the best example, but let's say I did have a layout component, right? And in this layout component, I'm just going to render my div. My nav would go here, since this is the part that's repeating. And I'll close out my nav. And then here, instead of rendering all this stuff in both of these components, instead I can render layout. Okay? This will wrap both of these components in this parent component that has the nav in there, right? It's supposed to. But right now when I save and I go back here, all I get is go here, right? I'm not getting the text that I put inside of, in between the open layout and close layout, right? It's a layout, so it should wrap the things that I want to display, right? Not just ignore them. how do I get this content into my layout component? It's going to be a prop, and it's a special prop. Do you remember what this prop's called? What's okay? That was a great guess. I do love guesses, and you were on the mark there. So we have this family analogy that we're always using, right? A lot in programming, right? Or this metaphor, I guess. And layout is going to be apparent to, even though doesn't look like a React child. This is technically a text kind of element. React, rather the layout component is going to be apparent to this component, to this text, right? So how would we access this in the layout component? We have props, that's true. There's one special, I think this is like the only special prop. Oh, besides key, but it's not really a prop. All right, so we can use props.children here. This will take whatever was passed in between the opening and closing brackets. For example, here we have layout, opening and closing. It's going to take whatever was passed in between there and just render them there. Okay, not too crazy. We already did talk about this in lecture, but we'll just go over it again just for the sake of the example. So this is kind of one approach for sharing mostly for sharing view logic. So for sharing like elements like nav that I'm going to have on every page, right? Instead of repeating that, I can just wrap it in this, right? Okay, this is approach number one. Let's say instead of these being functions, these were classes. And we're going to extend react.component. We're going to take this off. We're going to put a render method. We're going to return that thing, and then for each of these, we're going to close that out. And of course, I missed something. Let's see what I missed. Render return extends. Okay, great. Oh, I forgot this. Okay, great. And then just change this to this.props.children. Hopefully this works. Okay, great. We just converted those functional components to class-based components, right? And let's imagine that we actually need for both of these kind of pages or both of these kind of components, let's imagine that we need to make a fetch request, right? So in our component did mount, right? We're going to make a fetch request, and we can, just for now, I do already have a token in here, so I can make a fetch to my backend. Okay, great. I just need to send the auth header. I guess I followed the rules a little bit more on this one. Like technically it's supposed to follow this scheme or like this pattern. It doesn't really matter. It's going to work the same. And I'm going to grab local storage.token, meaning that the thing that I'm doing differently here is putting bearer in front. So let's see, I need to do that for both of them, and then for both of them I also need a piece of state, which is like the user. It's going to be an object, right? And I also need, when I finish this fetch, hopefully that syntax is right, when I finish this fetch, I need to then convert the response to JSON and set the state. User this dot set state. I'm going to say user is user. Hopefully this works. We'll test it. But just kind of adding that, what you might have already added. Oh yeah, that's right. I have the URL. Hopefully what you've already kind of have in your Mod 4 project, which is that you may be making a similar request in many different components, many different top-level components. Maybe not. Maybe you put it all in app. That's fine. Cool. So let's just make sure that our state is updated. I'm going to, for my return, going to render the state for my header. And similarly for my counter. Great, I've got something here, right? I need to fix this a little bit, but I have updated this state, right, with the thing that I got back from my fetch request, which is Chad Turbox. Great, so instead of user, it's going to be data. I'll just do data.user, so this makes a little more sense. And same for this one. All right, but hopefully this already feels a little bit boring and annoying. Repeating all this code across both of these components or multiple components, right? What we can do instead, in order to extract this kind of like logic and these lifecycle methods, right? If I just have this, it's a little bit harder to, for example, if I try to put my component data mount inside of here, that's fine. Like I can essentially do this, but then how do I pass this information to the children or to the component that it's being rendered in? Basically you can't, because then the layout is the only thing that owns that information. And this parent component has no way of knowing what like the information that layout is fetching is. But this is still a problem in the sense that it's really not dry. I don't want my code to be duplicated like this across components. What I want to do instead is just take out that stateful logic that's shared and put it into a new component. Okay. So what we'll do is we're going to create a higher order component, but it's really going to be a function that we're creating. So we'll just create a function. And the thing that we're doing is we're giving this like profile information to our components, right? To our header and our counter. Those are the two components that need that profile information, right? We're pulling it in here, we're pulling it in here. Doing the same exact thing, nothing is different, okay? So I'm going to call this, the convention is to call this with, and then kind of whatever you're doing. So I'll just maybe call this with profile, right? It's going to take in a component, okay? It's going to be a component that we're going to wrap in another component. All right, we'll see it in a second. We said that if we're going to extract this logic, we have to create a new component. That's true, right? But instead of using this.props.children in that new component, kind of like how we did with layout, instead what we're going to do is we're going to return a new component from this function, and in our case it needs to be class-based, class, and we'll just call this component, it doesn't matter. No, I guess we can't call it that. Call it something, it really doesn't matter. Extends react.component. And then from this inner component, we're just going to return, for the moment, let's return our component to be wrapped. Okay. In our render function. And this has to be capital or React will complain at us. Okay, great. Before we work on extracting that information, I just want to be super explicit about what's happening here. This is just a React class, the highlighted portion here, right? We built these, we know what they look like. We are essentially creating a constructor or a function which is going to create a new React class, which is going to wrap around or just render whatever component that we want to render, right? Whatever component we're passing in. So yeah, so let's take a quick look at it in the debugger. If we hit it, why is that? Oh, I've got it paused, hold on. Let's take a quick look at the debugger. So we're here, I'll make this a little larger. And we have right now this function with profile, hopefully. This is why I hate the debugger. Okay, let's log it. We have this function with profile. Great. We got it. We can see it here. Takes in a component, and then returns a component. And I'm going to take out these other console logs that I have so we can kind of focus a little bit more on this. Take this out. Take this out. Take this out. Okay. And I have one more. Sorry. Take that. Okay. So we can see our with profile right now is just that function. It's great, a regular function. In this case, it just returns a new component from React. And I want to see what happens when I call with profile with a component. What is the thing that's returned, right? This is what we're building up to. Let's say, since eventually we want our counter to be the thing that is wrapped with a profile or has this profile logic, I'm just going to pass this directly to pass counter directly to with profile. And we just get back a class. Okay, we just get back a class. The class that we get back here. Let me just minimize this. The class that we get back there is just the same class that we defined inside of our function, right? You see the name is the same. And what we can do with that now is we can say, hopefully, inside, if I move this up, above header, above this stuff, we can say that with profile can wrap around this component. All right, feel okay? We have a class definition. We're just putting it inside a function now. And I can redefine header and say now header equals this class that I created plus whatever functionality I want to give it. This is really what connect is doing, okay? When we say connect with React Redux, it's doing this. You're passing a full component definition to connect, and connect is giving some functionality to that component, okay? Let's see it though. Let's see if it changes how this header is rendered on the page. I'm going to save that, scroll back down to my app, or up to my app. I wanted to see header and counter, and I haven't told it to do anything differently, right? I'm literally just, in my with profile, just returning the thing that we passed in. So hopefully this is header at this point. This should also be header. We should see the same hello from header and the nav bar stuff in there. Great. We haven't changed anything yet. The thing about these higher order components is that since we're returning a class, we can also define custom functionality. We could return a functional component as well, but with a class we can create state and lifecycle methods to use, and then we can pass that information to this component as props. So what we're going to do, we're going to just extract this state here, and we're going to take it out of here as well. And we're going to take this whole component did mount and put it in here as well. We already know this works. We verified it in the console, right? It works inside of both of the components individually. And now the component that we're wrapping our header in has a piece of state, which will be the user. And when this component mounts, we're going to make a fetch request to our profile, convert the response to JSON, set the state with that data. And the last part about this is that these components still need to know what is the profile information, right? Like this was the whole point. I want to share this logic of grabbing the profile with these two components. Okay. Does this feel really, really weird yet? No? Okay. That's fine. Then we'll just keep going. And the way that parent components share information with child components is pass it through as props. That's it. Okay? We have done this part a million times. Okay? We're just creating a function which does it for us now. All right? So we're going to pass that information through as props. And, you get to decide what this prop is called. I'm going to call it user, and I'll just pass it as this state.user. And what I want to see is that now, hopefully in my header, I can probably, instead of saying hello header, I want to say something like hello person's name, whatever the person's name is. All right. So I'm making that fetch request in the parent component, which is wrapping the header, passing that information as props, hopefully. And I guess before this, we can just render props. Header. I want to just give that information to the header. All right. It kind of worked. I don't know. The data for my fetch request is like messed up, I guess. But you see here, now my header props has a prop called user, right? I never passed that from app, but it's going to get passed from my wrap, from my with profile function, right? So we see we do have the prop called header. We'll have to debug this for a second, probably nothing huge. And we get the default state from that parent component, again, which is the with profile component. And we just want to make sure that that information gets passed down to the component that we're going to wrap. Okay, so let's do a very quick debugging. I want to make sure I'm getting the data back. Great, got my outer data. Oh, right, and it's because I said data.user, and it's actually called outer. Great. Okay, so now hopefully we see initially our user is empty, right? And then we get a user back in the subsequent, whenever that fetch request is finished. And the beautiful thing about this, or the nice thing about this is that, components always update based on changes in state or new props, right? And what we've done is we've basically taken out this logic of grabbing that profile information from the individual components, put it into a higher order component, right, an abstraction, in order to share that information. And so now that this state is here, and we're setting state here, we still get the benefit of our component re-rendering, even though the state is not local to the component. We still get the benefit of it re-rendering because we're passing it down as props. Here. All right. Okay, so what you will see a little bit more often is that we're going to have a separate file here. So I'm just going to create a separate file for counter. And Elena encouraged me to use this tool, which I thought is actually really great. React snippets. If you haven't used it, I've never used it, but it actually really helps a lot. It's really fast. I don't have to type any of this crap out anymore. Yeah, I'll do it again. It's awesome. Okay, if I just put underscore, look at all of these things. Look at all of these. Okay, not all of them make sense right now, but like, I have a constructor. I don't have to type any of these things out anymore. If you install this package called React snippets, you have to go to install in Atom, or I'm sure VS Code has something similar. Go to install React snippets. You have to restart your Atom. That's the only thing that just tripped me up last night. I was like, why is it? It never works on my computer, but I just had to restart my Atom. Yeah, and then to get that full class-based component, just CER. It's the only one I've used. I'm sure there's another one, but this is the only one that I've used. Cool. So counter. Oh, the docs are really good for that package as well. There's it just lists all the shortcuts. It's really nice. Okay, great. So I've got my counter, and here I want to return. I'm gonna just do the same things that we were doing before. So I'm gonna grab my layout, put that in another file. This is also pretty common. Layout JS. Okay, great. I need to import React. Okay, I don't know. I'll keep the things, but it's fine. I need to export my layout. So I'm just breaking this into pieces, so it's a little bit more realistic, and so we can see what the higher order component, when we use with profile, what it looks like in the just single component file. Okay, so I got my layout, and I need to import inside of my counter. I need to import my layout from there. My counter component looks like this. Not this part. Cool. And what I want to do is wrap this counter. Instead of grabbing it from here, I'm going to import it from counter.js. Got all these messy imports. All right. This should still work. Layout's not defined. Let's see. In for default layout, import layout from layout. Layout's not. Oh, in app. Okay, great. So I'm just going to import my layout as well. Okay, great. So this should still look the same. We haven't wrapped the counter in anything yet. Okay, not yet. So with these higher order components, with this function that takes in a component, it's best if these are in their own file. They usually have a bit of logic. It's usually just easier to find them in their own file. You can take that out. I might, if I'm going to have a bunch of them, I might create a folder for it. And I'm going to call this with profile, HOC, just higher order component. I'm going to call it with profile.js, and I'm going to export this function by default. And I have to import React. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm going to import React. Yeah, and this should be it. So now that I have my with profile defined there, I've taken it out of this file. This is actually getting to look a little bit more realistic. I'm going to import it into the files that I need it here from HOCs with profile. Okay, beautiful. Yeah, that should work. And we see my header props and everything is still connected, right? Like the layout is imported correctly. The with profile prop, hopefully, yes, is imported correctly. That works for my header. But I've shown you something that may not make as much sense, which is to redefine a constant and then wrap the whole class definition. The only point that I'm trying to make here, which just took a minute to get there, is that what you're most likely going to see is that for a component that you want to wrap, you're going to import. Damn it. Okay. Once I learn it, I'm gonna just be so fast. I can import with profile from my HOCs with profile, and then here, instead of wrapping it again up here, what you normally see is to wrap it down here, just like connect. Okay. Connect is doing exactly this type of work. Okay. It's taking in, connect just has another function layer, which is why we have the two sets of parentheses. But connect is just taking in a component, adding some functionality to it, and then the enhanced component, the component with the powers now, is actually what's being exported, not just the plain component. All right. So this is our Clark Kent. This is our Superman. This is. I don't know any other superheroes' real names, so that's the only reason why I chose that one. Yeah, or Batman, I guess. So yeah, now that we've wrapped our counter in with profile, we should be able to see those props passed to counter as well. Okay, so we're just going to log props from counter, and hopefully we see that the profile information is passed down here. It is. All right. So I want to just show this in a more realistic application. And normally, instead of just passing down like the name, like now we have the name, we can just render the name or whatever. Especially with React Router, something that we want to do and something that you might have done already, we talked about it when we first talked about auth, is that we want to make sure that a user is logged in before they see some pages, right? We're going to create routes that are protected. And the way that we can do this is by creating a higher order component. And we usually call this with auth, but it doesn't really matter. And I'm just literally going to copy this because it's like a waste of time to do it all again. I'm going to copy all this over. And what we're going to say is that, we won't do this actually exactly. What we're going to say is that we do want to know whether a user is logged in or not. Okay. And we're going to say by default the user is not logged in. Okay. In our component did mount, how do we know maybe that a user is logged in? What's the condition that we have been using? Right, if there's a token in local storage. There's like one small case where sometimes the local storage token is undefined, so you could kind of get a false positive. But we can use that first. We'll say if there is no token in local storage. Right, if there's no token in local storage, then we can say this dot set state. We can say logged in is false. Okay, and then we can return just to kind of finish out the component did mount, right? To stop it from executing any further. And then down here we can kind of expect that there is a token in local storage because we've just finished the if statement. Like if there was no token, we will never get to this code. And at this point, then what we want to do is we probably want to make our fetch request, and we can kind of safely do this, at least for now, based off of the fact that we do have a token in local storage. This should mostly work. I'm going to open up my other application so we can see some of the logic that I put together for this in my components. So kind of really similar to what we just did. I have a bunch of shared logic in my components duplicated. It looks really bad, specifically in messages, matches, and profile. So we'll just open up those pages. And you'll see I've got a very similar type of logic here. I'm saying if there's no token in local storage, I do probably want to redirect. That's something that we'll need to account for in a moment, right? And if there is a token in local storage, then I'm going to make my fetch request. If I get unauthorized back as the status code, then I'm just going to throw an error to catch that unauthorized, and then I'm going to push someone to log in. Otherwise, I'm going to do whatever I need to do. In this case, for the messages page, I'm going to set the initial messages, but this just totally depends on what we're doing. And then you'll see for the profile page, there's also very similar logic. There's a piece that's different, but everything in this fetch, in the first conditional, in the second conditional, except for how to deal with the data, is exactly the same. Exactly the same as before. All right. So what I want to do then for with auth is to actually pull some of that logic out. So we've started already. We're saying, okay, if there's no token in local storage, for us, we're just using a piece of state. We don't have any router props in this higher order component, at least not yet. All right. And then what we want to do is we want to say, I'll just copy from this a little bit. If there is a token in local storage, then we'll make our fetch request, which we've got already. If we get back that is an unauthorized request, then we're just going to throw an error, right? I know we don't talk too much about errors, but it's fine. We can throw our own errors, and then we're going to say logged in is false. Or actually, at this point, it's already false. We just won't do anything for now until we can kind of change the location of the page. Then we are going to need to do whatever we need to do. So this other dot then here, this won't be shared because this totally depends on what page you're on, right? This part won't be shared. But what will be important is to set the state if we are able to successfully make this fetch request. We know that the user is logged in, right? There's no error. The user is logged in. We don't have to worry about it. So we can say that logged in is true. And we can let our components know the component, whatever component that we're wrapping in auth, we can let them know that the user is logged in. And if we want, we can also pass down the user information. This is totally like, you can figure out what your application needs, but logged in true is usually or logged in this.state.login is usually the pattern. So now that we have this higher order component, we have a little bit more work to do here, and it's going to blend into the work that we're going to do for Redux and Thump. What we want to do here is we want to wrap these components that need this capability with our higher order component called with auth. Let me change that. All right. The only thing this is doing is telling our components whether the user is logged in or not. Are we good on that? Okay. But now I don't have to put that logic in every single one of my components. That's the key part here. All right. So I'm going to take with auth. I'm going to import it in my messages page. Let's just go to messages to make sure that we've got everything here. Okay, great. I'm going to import it in the messages page. And from there, just like we did with the other component, I have connect here already. I'm going to wrap just this part with auth. Okay, this probably looks a little bit messy. It's okay. I think with our custom higher order functions, I want to keep it close to my component because I know I'm not doing too much work on that. I'm literally just wrapping it. Connect should be doing the same work. It really should not matter where you put this at because this is just function. This is called composition. It shouldn't really matter where you put this at. But I think just as a safety thing for me, I'm going to keep it close to my component. All right. And I'm also connected to the store, which we'll need to talk about in a second. So now all of this logic about, oh, am I logged in? I don't know, right? Okay, do I need to check the local storage? I also don't know. Do I need to do this stuff? This all is for login, right? And this is also for login, right? I can make this component now only make the fetch request that it needs to make and not have to worry about that logic around it that was all concerned with logging in, right? The only thing that I might do maybe is to say if this.props.logged in, which is why it's nice to have that prop there. I think I have 2 minutes, yeah. Yeah, I took out a lot of code. All the code that was duplicated, I just took out. And now, because my with auth higher order component passes down this prop about whether a user is logged in or not, I know that I'll only make this request if I'm logged in. Otherwise, I would redirect. And we can put that here, but we won't for now. Okay. got some errors. Let's see. I don't know. This is like the most common error, and I still don't know why I'm getting this. I changed too much. I should have tested. Let's see. Line 28 in in the render. Okay, messages page. 28. I'm gonna do something just to get around this error. If not, this.props.messages.length. All right. No. What? Okay, if not. All right, let's do this. Okay, how did I mess this up? We're just gonna. Oh, okay. Let's see if we have props here. It's not working, obviously, but we're just gonna push forward. Do we have any props? This is the question. This is what our higher order component is supposed to be giving us, right? So if we don't have props, then I really just messed up a lot. And great, we do have props. This is the key point of the lecture, right? Don't worry about this side. This part works, which is great. I know whether my user is logged in or not. So this is awesome. I can deal with this, right? I can do some logic based off of that. I hopefully can use that prop to then make my fetch request on component did mount. Maybe okay, because this is false. Oh, when the component first mounts. Then I'll just okay, we'll figure it out. I'm just gonna take this out. I think that's what's messing up my code. Nope, we're gonna ignore that. Okay. All right. So we get those props, which is really nice. The thing that we are kind of working on here is actually setting the messages, though. So we have. Okay, actually two things. So this logic here of like making that profile fetch request, right? Should I have to make that every page that I visit? Every time I switch components that need to be protected, should I have to make the same request? Yeah, probably not. Like that's kind of unnecessary, right? I can instead probably store that state globally in my redux store. So this is what we're gonna kind of work to. So we've got our redux that we're gonna work with. We can import connect. And this is the part that usually gets a little bit hairy or like tricky. So we've got our new component thing here, right? And I'm just going to define it here and return it down here, okay? Same thing, I'm just going to return something. That works the same, okay? What I want to do is connect this to the store so that I can update the store when, for example, when I log in, right? When I know that the user is logged in. This is the syntax for connect, right? This first function call takes up to 2 arguments, or like maybe a third one, doesn't really matter. Takes 2 that we know, so map state to props, map dispatch to props. And the question again was, do I need to make this fetch request if I know I'm already logged in, right? Do I need to make this fetch request on subsequent pages? The answer really is no. It's a lot of work. It's more network requests than we need, right? We can, again, take that logic out, put that state in a global place so that it's not bound to an individual component. Okay? Even though this state uh, is is kind of created for the wrapped components, it still only exists on each page, right? I'm just wrapping each page with this. That's still localized state. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to say, hey, I want my store to give me information about the current state. I think it should be state. I'm going to need to put this piece of state on my I'm going to need to put this piece of state in my store, but for now, we're kind of fine. We can work with it. I'm also going to want a way to update the state based off of this fetch request, right? If the fetch is successful and I get the user back, I want to tell my store that I am logged in. Okay? So I need map dispatch to props. This is the only way I'm updating global state. This is going to return an object just like map state to props. This object will be a bunch of functions though, and so I'm going to say set. I do already have a set current outer. Ours is going to do. It's just going to take in the outer, and it's going to call dispatch. Okay. This piece of data, it's kind of implied if I'm setting the current user, right? It's kind of implied that I'm logged in, but I'm just going to be explicit about it here. And so we're kind of back in Redux world for now. We're really kind of blending these two things together, okay? I know the wrapped, the hierarchy component is a new concept, but everything else is the same. It's really just a new component that we're creating, which has a child component, which is whatever we're wrapping. So we've got our map state props, we've got our map dispatch to props, and we want to be able to call in response to this fetch. Instead of using this dot set state, which is, we're saying we're going to extract this logged in state, right? What we're going to do is take this out. So we already have our initial state. Take this out. If there's no token, the initial state is false anyways. And instead, what we want to call is this function here in order to set the current outer in our application. This dot props dot set current outer. We're going to pass data. All right. Great. Something else is breaking. Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. Cannot read property logged in of null. So we were using down here. We were using this dot state, but we can actually just call this dot props dot logged in, which is coming from our global state. So hopefully this doesn't break too much. Okay, great. I've only kind of defined the like component layer of my Redux connection, right? I need to go back to the back, not to the back. I need to go back to my reducer and make sure that everything is hooked up there. So there's a piece of state called logged in that I want to update here. And I'm going to go to my reducers. I've got a, I'm doing this, but I think, yeah, let's just put it here. So we're going to create a case. We have a case called set current outer. We want to add another piece of state called logged in. You know what? I'm just going to create a new file. It's going to be more simple. Logged in reducer. So just so we can kind of isolate this state. So default state is false. I'm just going to call this logged in default. We're going to return this function. Again, the reducer takes in two things, the state and an action. And the action that we want to dispatch here is maybe logged in. So we'll go down this path instead. And what we're going to say is we want to return true if the reducer is getting this information that we're logged in, right? So dispatch is sending a message to the reducer. The message is saying, hey, I'm logged in. We can set this state to true so that at the top level, we know in our component that we're logged in. Okay. I know this comes in by default. You don't actually need the break. I think that's, I realized it was complaining a lot about that. Okay, so now we've got a new piece of state here. I'm using combined reducers. This is in the labs. I'm not going to really probably go over it too much. Logged in reducer, great. Yeah, logged in. Logged in default, logged in default. Oh, I'm not, let's see. Default. Got my return. Oh, I need to export. Export default function. Okay, here we go. All right, finally. This is our props from messages page, right? We just connected kind of the back piece of this, which is to give our store a piece of state called logged in, and a default state, which is false. And the thing that we want to do is just like update this piece of state. Our store is expecting an action called logged in order to update it. Okay. So we're just going to dispatch a second action in this same dispatch. This is not super common, but I am trying to just make a point, I guess. So we're going to dispatch logged in instead. I'm going to comment this out to tell our store, hey, we're logged in, like set my state to true. Okay. I'm going to save it, kind of go back here, and now we see the plumbing is there essentially, right? We did two things. We did two big things. Why don't we take a short break? Does that feel right? I'm feeling that maybe I've lost a lot of people. Why don't we take like a 5-minute break? Let's come back. We're just gonna do it again, look at it step by step, okay? See what this gives us, and then we'll be out early. All right?
By the way, is this in his lecture uploaded? I'll upload it.
It's not that early. 10:38. No, you won't. What do you want? Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. I just want to walk through what we have. We have two. Well, okay, we have one tiny thing. I'm just going to show you that you hopefully already make sense based on what we have already. Then the other thing has to do with the async actions that we'll integrate into our with auth. So what we've got, this page hopefully looks very familiar and safe. Not too much happening here. Just running React to the page, right? Our main component is called app. Inside of our app, this is when things kind of get a little crazy. We're importing React. We've got our browser router. We're doing React router and Redux together. Okay, important. We're grabbing our store from Redux, or our create store method. We're grabbing the provider component from React Redux. And from these two, we're going to create that store and then create that wrapper around all the components, right? In order for those components to have that context of the store. We're creating our store from what we're calling a root reducer. If you haven't gotten to these labs on combined reducers, just take a look at it. Okay, I'm just not going to talk about it too heavily, but it just allows us to put multiple reducers together. We're combining the reducers. Okay, each one has its own top level key in the state. So I've got this root reducer, which is what I'm actually pulling in these three reducers into, and these reducers look just like the ones that we wrote yesterday. Okay. Or on 2 days ago, even. We're kind of dealing with the logged in stuff right now because we're building out with auth. So this is our reducer here. There's really not, I might add one more, which is like logged out, right, to return false by default, but that's it. Or to change the state to false, but that's pretty much it, right? And then our app also has the router wrapped around everything. I've got 4 pages built, sign up, messages, matches, profile, and I've got 3 of these are routes that I want to protect, or like pages that I only want you to be able to visit if you're logged in. Okay, we're just working on one. I would love to have applied it to the other 2, but seeing as how the one broke, I'll fix it and then push the code. But we're just going to work on the one again. So we started off in messages, trying to get messages to be connected, 1 to auth, and then 2 to our store through the with auth higher order component. The way we're using the higher order component is just like connect. We're going to import it from someplace. We're defining the file, so we have to import it from our local project. And then at the bottom of the file, we're just going to wrap our component. Again, this shouldn't matter just be consistent, I guess. It really shouldn't matter how you wrap these. Wrap either here or out here. We're going to wrap our component with our custom higher order component. Okay. The thing that I want to show is that, okay, yeah, I can do this. The thing that I want to show is that not all components automatically kind of receive, or, sorry, I said that wrong. Let me rewind. The thing that I want to show is that there are other higher order components that we can just import and use automatically. Okay, and React Router gives us one that's pretty helpful. You know that if you have built out routes, it's probably gotten complex in the sense that if you want messages page to get some custom props from this component, you've got to change it to render. You've got to make sure to pass down the router props, right? We're just going to go ahead and do render for this real quick, ignoring the router props. Oh, actually, I'll do it for my profile. We're going to do it for the profile. Change this to render. We won't pass down the router props, and we're going to try to render it something with those props anyways. So we're talking about pre-created higher order components. Much like Connect, we're going to go to the profile page. And great, this breaks. It was working when I had component equals here, but it's breaking now because I was depending on having those router props, like history, for example, or match, or location. These are the only props that router gives us. But there is another way, okay? This is usually a little bit better for components that are more deeply nested. But given the example that we have, we're going to use it here. So React Router gives us this higher order component called with router. Again, with is just conventional. It doesn't really matter. Called with router. And all we have to do, same pattern as the other ones, we're just going to wrap our component in that. And that should give us, do you see how my page just stopped breaking? And right now it's breaking because it doesn't have access to history. But as soon as we wrap this with the router, we have access to it again. My page doesn't break. Okay. Just another higher order component that's in our tool belt. You can use this so that your components, usually deeper down in the component tree, you don't have to keep passing those router props like history, location, and match all the way down. You can just wrap it in with router. Okay. That's one thing. The other thing, though, if we go back to messages and we go back to our app.js, we should expect messages to be receiving those router props. Right? We're saying component equals, automatically it passes the router props. But when we log the props from messages, we don't get those props. There's one step that I missed here. So in our higher order component, again, we're creating a new class, right, on line 7. Creating a new class. This class should be just wrapping the class that we want to give the functionality to, right, and then returning it. And what's happening instead is that even though I'm wrapping the class, I'm not actually passing down the props that this class receives. So let's see. We're in our with auth. And I just want to see what props does with auth actually get right now, just by itself. It's getting all of these props, but we're not passing them down to messages page. This is pretty important, especially if you're going to use multiple higher order components like with router and connect and with auth. You always want to make sure, the only way it really works is if you always make sure to pass all the props back down. Set initial messages, right? Anyways, all of these I want to be passed back down as props to my messages page, not just kind of captured in my with auth component. So, this is actually, okay. Thank God, I figured out why my page broke. It was because of this. So I was never passing messages, so I never was able to render any messages because I'm just like This is honestly complex even for me. Right, I need to pass down these other props, and we know we have access to them by the stop props. We just saw them on the page. The nice and kind of easy way to do this is just by using the spread operator. I know it's everybody's favorite. In this area where you normally put props, just use the spread operator and spread out the stop props. Spreading out the props. Okay. The equivalent would be to say history, this.props.history, match, this.props.match, messages, right? This is too much, right? We don't even know, we can't even account for all the props that are going to be there because we don't know how wrapped someone's going to make this thing, right? How many times they're going to wrap it. So we're just going to pass down all the props. And honestly, if this works, I'm probably going to cry because I was sad that this broke. Okay, good. You won't see me cry today. But this is supposed to. Okay, now is it even more broken? Yes, no. Okay, great. At least I'm getting these props. I have to figure that part out, but this is the important part. I'm getting all the props in my messages page, which is important. Now I have the router props, so if I need to redirect to the step.props.history or use the step.props.history.push, I can. I still have my logged in false because I passed it down custom from my hierarchy component. But I also have these props that where I can again still set the initial messages, set the current order if I need whatever I need to do here. Oh, I didn't parse the JSON response. That makes sense. Okay, cool. All right. The last thing is thunk. Okay. We've talked a very little bit about action creators because there's not much to say. All right. Let's look at our with auth. This thing is an action, right? This thing, it's an object. It has a type property. That is what defines an action in our application. I'm going to take this out and create a file called loggedin.js, which is just going to export some functions. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. Yeah. And this function is just going to return that action. This function is called an action creator. It's just a function that returns the action. Okay. That's how I'm going to talk about it. And this function is nice. It's really nice to be able to use this. So we're going to export it here. We're calling it login. Up here, we can import it. Import login from actions / logged in. Make sure. Okay, great. And then down here, instead of creating a map dispatch to props function, we can use this action creator. Well, we can use it either here. We're going to dispatch login directly. We can call it directly. This is really what's happening kind of under the hood with the next thing I'm going to show. Or we can kind of ignore this altogether and just create an object here with setCurrentOrder and just pass our login function. Okay? And what's happening here, again, another abstraction. We should be used to it by now. We're gonna just kind of ignore what's really happening, I guess. We're passing this login function, right, which does not have access to dispatch. That's important. Up here, we're calling login inside of dispatch, right, when we're executing dispatch. But here, login doesn't have access to dispatch. What's changed here is that when you pass an object as the second argument to connect, all of these functions that you define will be called with dispatch. meaning that when we call setCurrentOrder, what's going to happen is React Redux will take this function and it will say, okay, obviously, you passed an object here. You want to just use whatever is created from this function to call dispatch with. So it's just going to do this. It's going to call dispatch and execute that function there. That's it. All right. This is like step one, but this is, we don't, it's okay. You don't have to use this like this, okay? This will just make this other example a little bit more clear. And for logging in, right now we're just saying kind of like return logged in. But in general, we know that logging in is an asynchronous action, right? It takes a second or so. And what we want to do is we want to say, we're going to talk about all this in a second. What we want to say is when we are logging in, sorry, and it's too much scrolling. When we're logging in is async, right? And instead of having an action creator, a function that returns an object with a type, right, like this, we want to probably just have some function which will eventually get executed, right, and eventually called dispatch. This is really our what we're trying to do with login. We're saying, actually, eventually I'm going to call dispatch. Now you can use the approach that we've already taken, which is that we have a fetch in our higher order component, or in your component, doesn't really matter. We have a fetch here, and we're essentially calling dispatch down here, right? This is fine, okay? You don't have to use thunk, which is what we're going to talk about in the next 5 minutes. This is okay, because this works, right? But there's another way, especially if you're using action creators. What you can do is instead of returning an object here, we're going to return a function, okay? This function is going to take in dispatch as an argument, right? Because we need access to dispatch, right? Dispatch is kind of implied for this one, but here we have to be explicit. We need access to dispatch. And eventually, once our fetch, for example, finishes, we want to call dispatch with this action, okay? And the reason why this is kind of nice for us is that we can kind of take a lot of this logic out of here. What we can do is just say, okay, I do need to make a fetch request. Let's just take that part out. Cool. I need to make a fetch request, and then eventually I want to call dispatch, okay? And then maybe even before I call that fetch request, I want to let my application know that I'm currently logging in, meaning that like this is an asynchronous action, right? I want to capture kind of like when it's happening so I can show a loading spinner, for example, which is a nice UI experience, which is nice user experience. And then I'm going to kick off my asynchronous action, and eventually I'm going to say, okay, I finished, like I'm logged in already now, right? And in order to do this asynchronous type of work, we actually have to use another, well, not another higher order component. We're actually just going to use what's called middleware for this create store function. We get this by importing thunk. Let me see, I think that I have it, but maybe not. Okay, no. So I'm going to add thunk to my project. Or actually, did I call it wrong? Redux thunk. It's really important to not do what I just did. You should make sure the name is right. You know, people put like viruses on here and stuff, right? That's important. So hopefully I won't be hacked. And, I'm going to import Redux thunk. And okay, great, super small package. It's literally a couple lines of code, which allows us to do this thing. And then inside of our code, we're going to import thunk wherever we're calling create store. So if you call it an index or if you call it an app, it doesn't really matter. Redux thunk. Great. And then we need to, there's one more thing that we need to do is thunk is a piece of middleware. Anybody remember what that kind of means from maybe mod 2? If you have a whole think about think about when you get a request to your backend, right? There's like a bunch of things that happen before that request even touches your controller. All of those steps are pieces of middleware. It's just literally something that's happening in the middle of a process. Okay, you can kind of insert things in the middle of a process. For example, using sessions, that's like middleware for your Sinatra applications, or like converting whatever response to JSON, that might be a piece of middleware, right? We're going to use middleware called thunk. So thunk is a piece of middleware for Redux. And what we're trying to do again here, or what this middleware allows us to do, is instead of returning an object, and we got an error before saying like, oh, you must return a plain object from an action creator, or dispatch must take in a plain object. Instead, what we can do is just return a function which takes in dispatch, or which will be given dispatch. Okay. And now, we're going to make it. We got 1 minute. Now, for set current auditor, I'm going to set it to login async, which is our thunk method here in our logged.in.js file, our login async. It should actually dispatch 2 actions. I want to look at my logged in reducer, or my login reducer. Logged in reducer. I'm just going to log my action.type just to debug this. Got my login async. I'm calling it set current auditor. And instead of making my fetch request here, we can leave this other stuff there. I'm just going to call this .props.setCurrentAuditor. Okay? This is going to kick off the fetch request. So I'm taking even more things out of my component, potentially. This is going to kick off the fetch request because this is going to call this function, which will create an initial dispatch, which should say, hey, I'm in the process of logging in. Make the fetch request, and once that fetch request is finished and successful, like I should be moving all the error handling logic over here too, but let's say we did. Once that is successful and finished, then we're going to say, hey, we're good, we're logged in. Yay! We have all these same old errors, but if we just look through the weeds, we get our logging in, which is the first thing that kicks off. And then eventually our state is updated to say that we have been logged in, okay? Thunk literally does one small thing for us, which allows us to do asynchronous actions. And it's the most helpful, again, when you're using action creators, okay? This is a choice for you. If you're doing a lot of actions, they have like a lot of computation, okay, this makes more sense. Otherwise, we can do all of this in the component as well, okay? So don't get too hung up on this if it's just like not going to make sense. We sent out labs for this, so there is some resources there, and there should be resources in the labs. The documentation, again, for React, Redux, Connect, Thunk are pretty good. Any questions before we head out? Does everybody feel super prepared? Good. That's where you're supposed to be. All right. Cool. So